Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are diving deep into a really specific choice in modern game development. It's a choice that often separates, the amateur work from a really polished professional release. Our mission is to look at the transition of a survival horror. We're going from its earliest form, which was a public demo, to what's now on the final release version. And the game itself is basically pure arachnophobia, survival horror, and it's all driven by this terrifyingly smart spider in a really claustrophobic lab. The early teaser for it was a hit. It proved the concept worked, but then when the developers went to build the final, they made this massive decision. They rebuilt that entire original demo. They didn't just clean it up, they threw it away. And that's our puzzle for today. Because for so many games, a demo or a pilot, it kind of becomes the first level, maybe the tutorial. Why did the Huntsman team throw away working assets?
Yeah.
Why commit to this time-consuming overhaul and start from scratch? It's a question that really touches on uniformity, technical debt, and I think the really high standard.
Right. And what's fascinating here is the language the developers themselves. They were very clear. They said the initial release was strictly a proof of concept, POC, and that distinction is it's critical. It tells you everything about why they decided to rebuild. POC isn't a beta version. It's definitely not a finished episode of a game, ready to be plugged in. The whole point of that first demo, its only mission, was to prove one thing. Could the idea of a terrifying smart spider in a dark metallic lab environment, could that actually create compelling horror? And it did. The proof was there. So the demo's job was done. The developers realized that what works for a quick 5-minute teaser built under pressure is just completely incompatible with the standards in full game. So we're going to get into how the final version ended up being so different, and more important, the specific design and technical reasons that made them say, okay, we have to sacrifice 6 months of work for the sake of code.
So let's start right there. At that proof of concept, it did its job, right? Played it, you got the tension, you saw the basic AI of the spider, you felt the claustrophobia. It set the mood perfectly.
It did. It absolutely nailed the vibe.
But the source material is really clear that the POC was, it was inherently limited. And this is key, especially if you're a developer out there wondering where all the time goes or just a player confused by delays. We have to talk about what that demo was. It was not built with the structural integrity of a final game chapter, not even close.
Not at all.
I mean, think about what you need for a good, solid 45-minute chunk of a survival horror game. You need a real puzzle structure, something that can, track your inventory across saves. You need deep environmental interactions, things that trigger plot points, and you need the full suite of polished mechanics, the player movement, the controls, and especially for a creature like a spider, you need that complex inverse kinematics for its legs to look. The POC had none of that.
Exactly. It was a sketch. It was probably held together with temporary code and placeholder asset. It was designed to work for 10 minutes just to prove the idea.
And that leads right into this idea of technical debt, right?
It leads directly to it, yes.
Yeah.
Technical debt is just the cost of all the shortcuts you take early on, a cost you eventually have to pay back. And the Huntsman situation is, it's a textbook example of the usual move in the gaming industry. You build a demo fast. You cut corners to get funding or to test the market. You might use low-res assets, simple collision code that's not optimize it all. And they did what they needed to do. They established the basic feeling of the environment and the core idea of the terrifying spider. Those concepts were priceless. But the technical shell around them, the actual code, the initial asset, they were just loaded with technical debt. They weren't scalable. They were probably inefficient. And trying to jam them into the framework of the full high-fidelity game would have actually cost more time and money than just starting over. The proof was in the concept, which is great, but the code itself was disposable.
That context is so important. So we're not talking about just cleaning up a dusty old asset. We're talking about structural incompatibility. And this is where it gets really interesting, because now we move from that conceptual sketch to the massive architectural overhaul they had to do for the final game. The difference between that old POC and what you can buy on Steam today is it's a staggering leap in scope and scale. The source material says it required massive upgrades across the upgrades that just fundamentally changed the technical requirements for every single asset. So this is way beyond simple polishing or bug. This was a complete overhaul of the engine and the asset.
Like a little teardown.
Yeah. So let's drill down into the 3 specific areas of enhancement, because this is where all the time and money went. First, you have the overhaul of the visuals and atmosphere. The graphics were upgraded. And when we say upgraded, we're not just talking about higher res, probably talking about moving from simple static baked lighting, which is common in demos.
Right, it's cheap and fast.
And transitioning to something like complex, dynamic, ray trace lighting or advanced global illumination that allows for these incredibly precise moving shadows and dynamic light sources that just, they maximize the horror. It makes a simple lab feel infinitely more terrifying.
And to jump in on that, that kind of shift is not trivial at all. If the original POC used low-res textures without proper physically based rendering PBR. Then trying to integrate those old assets into a modern PBR pipeline is a total nightmare. The old textures just don't have the necessary data. They don't have the roughness maps, the metallic maps, all the things that tell the engine how a surface should react to light realistically. You'd spend weeks trying to manually create that data for old assets, and even then they'd still look worse than the new stuff. So it's an efficiency problem disguised as an aesthetic one.
Exactly. And that leads right into the second big area, the core mechanics and animations. The player systems, the animations, they were all completely refined. In a horror game, immersion is everything.
It's the only thing that matters.
So a slightly glitchy jump, an awkward interaction with a door, controls that feel even a little bit imprecise. It just shatters the tension. It pulls you right out of the experience. And then think about the spider. Moving from a rough demo animation to the final product probably meant implementing complex skeletal inverse kinematics, IK.
Right, so its legs actually connect to the ground realistically.
Yes. The spider's 8 legs dynamically adjust to the uneven terrain in real time. It makes its movement look so fluid and natural and just horrifyingly purposeful. If the original POC didn't have that IK system, then the old spider model and its animations are they're useless. They're not compatible with the new movement logic.
And then you have the third area of enhancement, the sheer content and world expansion. The game loop itself was expanded so dramatically they didn't just polish the one spider. The developers added diverse types of spiders, and each one demands different tactics from you, entirely new puzzles. So that means the original sparse lab environment from the demo was no longer enough.
It wouldn't support it.
No. The full game needed a more sprawling, interconnected world. You have the industrial exterior, the sterile labs inside, the ventilation shafts you have to crawl through. If the old level's architecture couldn't support that kind of narrative flow and puzzle complexity, then trying to keep it would have been totally counterproductive.
So all of these the visuals, the mechanics, the content, it all boils down to one.
It does. It boils down to the absolute non-negotiable need to ensure a consistent and uniform experience for the player. That's the key takeaway for understanding modern game design integrity. Just imagine you're playing Huntsman for the first time. You want the quality bar to be set high from the very beginning and to stay there. If you start the game with a lo-fi, clunky, unpolished Chapter 1, that old demo, and then suddenly 10 minutes in, you jump to the hyper-refined, complex, beautiful standards of the full game. That transition is just jarring. It creates this huge aesthetic disconnect.
I have to push back a little on that, though. I get the aesthetic disconnect. I really do. But if the old demo was functional, couldn't a good technical artist have just, run those old assets through the new pipeline? Why was a complete manual rebuild the only option? It just seems so extreme, especially when you think about the budgets that most indie horror games are working.
That's an excellent point. And it gets to the heart of the difference between incompatibility and just being low quality. We aren't just talking about textures that look a bit fuzzy or an animation that's a little stiff. We're likely talking about deep, fundamental technical incompatibility. For instance, imagine the POC was built on an older, unoptimized version of their game, and maybe one that handled physics or lighting calculated in a completely different way. So when they upgraded that engine for the final product, maybe to use new multi-threading features or advanced rendering, the old level geometry, the old collision meshes, even the basic scripts for opening a door might have just broken. Or they would have required so many manual fixes and patches that rebuilding it from scratch was actually faster and cleaner. The source material is very specific. It says the colors, textures, animations, and all the small details were rebuilt to match the full game standard. That word rebuild suggests the original assets were fundamentally incompatible with the finished game's pipeline.
So it's not just that they didn't look good, they literally couldn't work together.
Exactly. You couldn't force them in without introducing bugs, performance drops, and instability right at the beginning of the game. And you just can't ask a player to forgive that kind of inconsistency in the first 10 minutes, especially not in a horror game where the atmosphere is so fragile. The concept survived, but the execution, almost all of the technical work, had to be redone to ensure total coherence.
That distinction is so critical. The technical incompatibility versus the lack of polish. It really highlights that this wasn't some art whim. It was an engineering to avoid crippling tech. And that leads us right to the big design question that the developers must have known every fan was going to ask. Why not just section it off? Why reject that common structure everywhere? Why not just keep the original demo, polish it up a little, call it episode 0, the outbreak or something, and then release the refined version as
a prologue?
Exactly, a prologue. We see this all the time. Think about a long-running TV show. The pilot episode often looks cheaper, has different actors, a slightly different tone, but it gives you the context you need. The source even uses the analogy of a game like Little Fighter 2, where you move through distinct separate stages. So why reject that model in favor of the monumental task of rebuilding the entire?
This is where you really see their priority: quality and immersion over just reusing apps.
It's a huge commitment.
It is. And we connect this to the bigger picture of game design philosophy today. The decision to rebuild Instead of segmenting it off, it really rests on three solid pillars. These aren't just excuses, they're design principles based on player expectation and what was technically feasible. The source material is pretty clear on why segmentation was rejected. The first pillar is what we can call the content deficiency. It's the structural gap. The core problem here is that the POC was just structurally insufficient. It couldn't function as a complete satisfying episode of a game.
It was too thin.
Way too thin. Think about what a commercial chapter needs. It has to hold your attention for, say, 45 minutes to an hour of meaningful gameplay. It needs complex state management. If you solve a puzzle, the game has to remember that after you save and quit. The POC, by design, was just a linear showcase, a quick sprint to show off the spider. If they had shipped that as Chapter 1, players would get this 15-minute, narratively shallow, mechanically simple introduction.
Why didn't they get hit by a truck?
Exactly. Followed immediately by Chapter 2, which is this sprawling, sophisticated 2-hour experience full of complex resource management and puzzles. That imbalance just ruins the pacing and the progression of the whole game.
Yeah.
The POC simply didn't have the density of puzzles or story hooks to stand on its own.
That makes a lot of sense. It would feel like a cheap add-on, not a real part of it. But let's play devil's advocate for a second. Isn't that commitment to a continuous flow just a sort of high-minded way of saying they didn't want to deal with players complaining that Chapter 1 looked worse than the rest of the game? I mean, let's be honest, players complain about everything. So is this second pillar, the quality and consistency, really a deal breaker? Or is it just managing risk?
I would say it is absolutely a deal breaker, especially in this genre. In survival horror, immersion is the primary tool for generating fear. So this second pillar is all about that player experience gap. If you start the game with that lower quality demo, with its less responsive controls, rougher textures, simpler lighting, and then you force the player to immediately jump to the highly refined full version, the result is more than just a visual shock. It creates what I'd call functional distrust.
Functional distrust.
Yeah. Imagine starting the game and the flashlight beam is just this static cone of light and the spider's movement is a little stiff. Then 10 minutes in, you hit a loading screen for Chapter 2, and suddenly the lighting is fully dynamic, the flashlight has realistic physics, and the spider moves with this complex, terrifying agility. The player doesn't think, oh, they upgraded their engine. They think, the controls feel different now, or why is the game so inconsistent?
It breaks the rules you just learned.
Precisely. That lack of uniformity shatters the immersion and kills the tension. And for a horror game, that is fatal. The developers knew that their contract with the player was for consistent, high-quality performance from start to finish.
Okay, that's a very strong point. It's about maintaining the reality of the game world.
And that leads directly to the third and maybe the most defining pillar of all, the structural choice, which is their commitment to a continuous flow. The Huntsman game is fundamentally designed to be one long nightmare, a single, continuous experience, not a series of separate chapters like, say, a Telltale game. In a continuous flow game, you need to seamlessly scale the difficulty, the tension, the resource. Separating the demo would have created this huge technical and narrative bottleneck. For instance, the inventory system and resource management had to flow smoothly from the absolute beginning.
Right, you can't have one system for 10 minutes and then switch to another.
You can't. If the POC's code couldn't support that, forcing a rebuild meant they could ensure that all the core system saving, resource tracking, enemy spawning were integrated flawlessly into one single cohesive code base from the start. They chose a seamless journey over saving time because they knew any inconsistency would compromise the very atmosphere they were trying so hard to create.
That idea of continuous flow is fascinating because it implies the risk they took wasn't just technical. It was a huge gamble on time and money that they felt was absolutely necessary to deliver their artistic vision. It's all about maintaining that uninterrupted tension.
Yeah.
Reusing the POC would have literally put a jarring technical pause button right at the start of that nightmare. It's like having the first 5 minutes of a movie shot on an old camcorder before it switches to full IMAX. The quality difference would just yank you right out of the story. So if they threw away the code, the textures, the level assets, what actually remained from that initial proof of concept? We have to separate the idea from the implementation because they didn't start with a totally blank page. They started with a concept they knew worked.
A validated concept, that's the key.
So it wasn't the technical blueprint that survived, it was the philosophy of the game. We can probably list the 3 core conceptual elements that made it from the POC to the final. These were the anchor. First, and most obviously, the central idea of the antagonist, the spider. The role of the spider as this constant, clever hunter that was proven by the demo, even if the final spider model was completely new and way more complex.
The fear was there.
The fear was second. The basic aesthetic survived. The core sense of that industrial lab environment, the metallic claustrophobic feeling, the mood, the color palette of those muted grays and cold blue, that all. Even if the final textures were rebuilt with higher fidelity, the architectural feel, the blueprint of the setting was preserved. And third, certain overall design ideas carried through, maybe the philosophy of resource scarcity, the limited flashlight battery, not having many distractions, or the focus on evasion and stealth instead of fight. These were the conceptual pillars that made the POC and they became the guide for the
What survived was the essence, the conceptual base. And this is such a vital lesson for any creative project where you have to iterate fast. Why were these the only things that survived? Because they are totally separate from the immediate technical execution. You can rebuild a lab environment using brand new assets and a better engine, but the underlying concept, I'm being hunted by an intelligent spider in a confined, dangerous maze, that's the unique hook. That defines the product.
Right.
Everything else.
Yeah.
The specific low-res textures from the demo, the rough early animations that didn't have the complex IK, the simple materials, the inefficient code, all of it had to be rebuilt.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine the development meeting where they had to tell the art team, hey, you know that 4 months of environmental modeling you did for the demo? Yeah, we're throwing all of it away because the shader model doesn't work with the new renderer.
Ooh,
That takes real commitment to quality. And it's backed by the belief that the core concept, the spider and the claustrophobia, was strong enough to justify that massive effort. The POC proved the idea was golden, and they were willing to pay whatever price it took to make sure the execution was just as flawless and uniform.
So let's shift gears and talk about the payoff. After all of this rebuilding and this intense commitment to uniformity, what does the player get when they finally hit new game on the schemer? We're moving from the concept to the full realized
Finished product.
the finished product. And as an updated and expanded version, it really does deliver on that promise of a uniform and professional. And critically, it vastly expands the game. It goes way beyond the simple evasion mechanics from the PO. This is where all the depth and complexity that was missing from the demo finally shows up. The feature set is just so much richer now. It's a complete survival horror. It's got extensive environmental exploration, pushing you to move through this expanded, interconnected setting, all while you're trying to evade these spiders. And the game now has a huge range of puzzles and challenges, which gives it the structural depth the POC lacked. You know, multi-step interactions, complex object puzzles, environmental obstacles that force you to really think about.
And that expansion of content wasn't just, for show. It was fundamentally necessary to justify the price of a full game. Crucially, the world expansion also brought in diverse spider types, so the threat evolves over time.
You're not just dealing with one enemy anymore.
No, you're no longer dealing with a single enemy behavior. This forces you to use different survival tactics, to manage your resources differently, to constantly shift your strategies. It keeps the tension from ever becoming predictable or monotonous. The source material specifically says the final game is much more frightening and detailed than the POC, and that is the direct result of their commitment to rebuilding it from the ground up. And on top of all that, the complexity of resource management became a huge factor in the final game. You have to critically manage your resource, the limited battery for your flashlight, the few useful objects you can find, and using the environment to create distraction. This adds a whole layer of strategic tension that makes the horror much deeper than the simple cat and mouse chase from the demo.
A complexity that you just could not have bolted onto the old demo's code.
No way. It had to be built from the ground up to integrate perfectly with all the new systems.
And that's really the resolution of the story. The success of the final game confirms that the goal was always to provide a continuous, high-quality gameplay, a seamless narrative flow that just wasn't possible if they had tried to staple that lower-quality demo onto the front of the refined game. I think it's such a valuable insight in technical sacrifices and the relentless pursuit of quality control in modern. When you play a game that feels seamless, when the lighting, the movement, the details all stay consistent for hours, it's usually because a massive amount of work went on behind early inconsistent assets like the ones from the Huntsman PO ever through the cracks. So the sacrifice of those old assets was a necessary trade-off for the professional, uniform quality product.
It's the gold standard of industry practice. You recognize that an initial idea, no matter how powerful it is, often needs a completely new execution to meet commercial standard. And this raises a really important question, I think, for both creators and for consumers who follow the gaming space. We've established that the standard is often to rebuild from a proof of concept to guarantee that uniformity, to prioritize that continuous, seamless flow. But this manual, meticulous rebuilding process, like we saw with Huntsman, is incredibly resource intensive. It takes a lot of time and money, it causes delays, and it increases budgets.
Which makes sense. I mean, if you have a team of developers spending months rebuilding assets that were already, technically functional, even if they were inconsistent, that is a massive investment in quality control.
Exactly. So we have to ask, how might future technologies, specifically things like rapid asset generation driven by AI or these increasingly sophisticated procedural generation tools built right into game engine, how might they challenge or maybe even reinforce the need for this kind of manual rebuilding?
So could an AI just fix the old assets automatically?
Potentially. I mean, if an early POC is built with basic assets, But a next-gen AI tool could instantly analyze the aesthetic signature of your final high-fidelity game and then automatically upscale, remap, and retexture those early assets to match the new pipeline. Would developers still be forced to throw away working concept? Or will technology eventually allow for a more automated scaling of quality, taking you from a lo-fi POC directly into a hi-fi, continuous, polished final product without that massive rebuilding phase? It's this tension between artistic vision and algorithmic efficiency that's going to continue to define game development for years to come. And I think the case of Huntsman will always be a perfect reminder of why that uniformity is so critically important to begin with.